Dr. James Hollis, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you again.
Well, it's great to have you here again. And in the past, we've discussed some of your earlier books, and today we're going to be discussing one of your most recent ones, which is titled Prisms, Reflections on the Journey We Call Life. Such a small topic. What prompted this particular book at this particular time?
Well, this book is a collection of 11 essays on various subjects, and many of them written in the last year. So therefore, there's some reflection on the times we live in. The subject matter ranges from issues of disorders of desire, aging, the wounded healer, reframing your sense of self in plague times, assessing what rolls beneath the surface of our lives. But I also wanted to include a chapter in there on comedy and fill with a lot of jokes. So I hope people have a good time reading that chapter too.
Oh, good. Well, there was a line in the preface that I particularly resonated to. And you wrote, if the first half of life is about what does the world want from me and how do I meet its demands, the second half is about what wants to enter the world through me. And I thought that was, no pun intended, but a particularly pregnant line. And that we're both in that second half of life, where that's the question that we've wrestled with for some time now.
Well, sure. I think when we're born, we're lying close to the center of our personal authority, which is called instinct. But being tiny, vulnerable, and dependent, we are naturally obliged to trade it away every day in 1,000 necessary adaptations. And so the first half of life is essentially a social obligation, me in the world, me dealing with my parents, with playmates, with the school teacher, and widening circles of expectation, demand, and instruction. And so we slowly trade off those sources of knowing that are within each of us for fitting in, for adapting. And it's a good thing we are adaptive creatures, or we'd have even more difficulty in life. But there comes a point somewhere in the course of one's life, or at least in the lives of most people, where we sort of have to resurface, maybe in the 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever, and say, so what is this life about anyhow? Why am I here? Am I just supposed to repeat these choices for the rest of my journey? Why is it when I've done all the right things, when I've made my adaptations in the world, maybe been productive and successful in the world as defined by somebody else, why does it not feel right inside? It's at that point we begin to sort of turn within and ask a different kind of question. And we're always in service to something, whether we pay attention to that or not. At first, we think we're young, we're free, we leave our parents behind, but we're carrying all of those instructions. We're either repeating them, running from them, or trying to fix them in some unconscious way. So we're always present to that. So in the second half of life, if I may use an ancient word, soul here, which is after all the literal translation of the Greek word psyche, which is what makes us psychological beings. The soul is about meaning. What is the meaning of my life? Yeah. How am I to live it? In service to what? Those questions have to come up. And we all necessarily leave good parts of ourselves behind. In those adaptations, you can't do all things. And so many times there are interests, talents, enthusiasms that are left behind and are clamoring for some kind of attention. But more importantly, I think, is the question of what is it that I'm here to be, to embody, that's not in terms of my job, my external relationships, but what has this journey been about? That's a different kind of question. And it's at that point, I think, that whether we know it or not, we're really asking the question, what is wanting to be embodied in this world, in this lifetime, by me? Whatever sets us in motion, call it the gods, call it genetics, call it nature, whatever you want to call it. there's something here that each of us is meant to embody. In other words, we're like a chip in a great mosaic, tiny, indistinguishable at first, but every chip is necessary to fulfillment of that mosaic. So what is it that I'm to bring to the table? And when I say that, I'm not talking about something grandiose or even public. It's what am I asked to value, embody? What am I asked to devote my energies to? Apart from all the other legitimate claims of the social contract going on around me. So it's a rather long answer to a very direct question, but it's complicated.
Actually, I got hooked by the very first thing that you said, which was you said we were born and we are closest to our authority at that point.
Uh-huh.
That was an interesting thought. What? We have any authority after we're first born? What are you thinking
Well,
there?
our authority, in the sense in which this organism that each of us represents knows what is right for it. Nature knows, but we're also social creatures, as you know. And Freud said once very succinctly, the price of civilization is neurosis, meaning we have our instinctual agendas and we have the social claim upon us around us, and a legitimate claim it is. It's no great sort of cost to us to stop at a stop sign. That's a legitimate claim of our social contract. But many of the trade-offs we have to make in our life, again, separate us from ourselves, and we become self-estranged. That old word neurosis is really about this, serving two agendas, the natural one and the socialized one. And the wider the divergence, the deeper the split within, the deeper the suffering, the deeper the pathology that results as a byproduct of that.
I wanted to, I mentioned the preface, and I was also intrigued in the preface where you talk about your own journey and how you found yourself in the academic world, and there was this supposed publish or perish thing. Now, I also came through an academic life, long retired already now, and I deliberately chose an institution that didn't seem to have that pressure at that time. And then I ended up publishing stuff anyway. And you had a kind of similar experience.
Yes, I did an early work on the emergent British playwright Harold Pinter, and then I went dry for many years. I just didn't feel as if I wanted to produce, to sort of lash those inner figures into some kind of submission. And so for about 20 years, I didn't write anything. And during that time, of course, I was raising a family and I was retrained in analytic psychology in Zurich. So I was certainly being busy. But when I came back to ask myself, what is it that I'm finding interesting to think about, reflect on, what am I seeing with my patients and so forth? It was at that point I began to find various ideas emerging that wished expression. And the one thing I've always identified with is being a teacher. I loved learning. Teaching was always my calling. And so I just considered books another way of teaching. It's a bigger classroom.
Yeah. And I believe this is your 17th or 18th book.
That's right, 17th.
17th book for somebody who was not going to bow to publish or perish, but you were already on your own Jungian track, determined to listen to your own soul's calling, which was not to publish a bunch of books to fit into a particular academic slot requirement. And you managed to develop an academic career sidestepping all of that.
That's correct. Yes.
More power to you. And you mentioned as you were going through chapter headings and so on, I liked you describe archetypes as the large forms rolling beneath our lives. I'm getting the image of bowling pins or something, being in a bowling alley. Large forms rolling beneath our lives. I love that description because what's your sense of what's rolling beneath us in this strange time that we're in?
Well, there's an old Ojibwe saying, I go about worrying with all of my little worries, and all the while great winds roar across the sky. And I think probably a few centuries ago, someone was thinking about his or her place in the universe. And so it is with us. We get preoccupied by the demands of, daily life. We all have those demands. But we have to say, what gives depth and rhythm to our lives? If you ever read Jung's memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, at the
Yes.
end of his work, where he's sort of summarizing, he's extremely modest. And if anybody had any right to making grand pronouncements about life, it would have been Jung. But he says basically, I really have nothing that I want to declare. Some of my best choices worked out poorly for me, and some of my defeats and failures led to the best achievements in my life, and so forth. And he said, I'm certain of only a couple of things. One is there's been a certain consistency in my life from childhood to this present moment. He was in his 80s when he was speaking. And secondly, he said, there's been some force that's wishing its expression through me all that time. He was in service to that. And so I think that's sort of where I've come out too. Also, I'm about to be 81.
Me
And
too. We're age mates.
yeah, well, that's be born in 1940, right?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Much was happening in the world at that time, that's for sure. And
Yeah. Second World
so,
War.
exactly. So, and by the way, for those who weren't there, it was something that permeated the atmosphere. While I grew up Midwest, safe, protected, and other children in the world were not, I was very acutely aware of the risks and dangers and sorrows of the world, because it was in the atmosphere around us. You could see it in the big people, and you heard about it, and you saw pictures of it, and so forth. So it was a shaping influence on
Yeah.
my early childhood, for sure.
When I was a little guy, I had a sort of a general's military uniform, and and at the movies, I'm told I would stand when the newsreel would come on. I would stand up and salute.
Yes.
So at a very young age, I was prepared to,
Mhm.
in no very realistic way, but I was prepared to be a soldier and to be a
Yes.
hero, and
Yeah.
and I'm sure that's well, I know that's left an imprint on my life.
Yes. And I had the same thought because it was all around us. And
Mm.
I was also aware of the grief around us too, because I saw people weeping, and I saw stars in the window that indicated their sons were not coming back, and that sort of thing. So it hit close to home a few times. So,
Yeah.
at any rate, the force is rolling beneath us. You have to say, what is moving my life through the biological changes, which are fairly easy to see as we grow and we age? But what are the psychological changes? And what are the promptings going on inside of me? I mean, there's a whole other authority. There's a whole other locus of knowing in each of us. The human ego tends to inflate itself from time to time and say, well, I'm the boss here and I'm in charge. And I don't think that works out too well in the long run, because in any given moment, that ego's in service to some of those forces within. Some of them contrary to our best interests, such as the complexes we pick up along the way, and some of them are the healing and helpful and developmental sources. And I think we can say of the psyche, it has two basic agendas. One is growth and development, and secondly is self-healing. It's a self-healing system.
Mhm.
So from the analytic standpoint, we have to welcome our symptoms, not because we enjoy them, but we see that they are indications of something expressing its disfavor within us. In other words, if I've done all the right things, if I followed the roadmap that my culture gave to me, and inwardly there's this sense of hollowness or depression or self-medication or lack of enthusiasm for whatever it is I've devoted my energies to, then I have to stop and pay attention. And then say, all right, but what is the soul wanting of me? It's a whole different question. And I was
Ex-
privileged at midlife to have a depression. At age 35, I entered my first hour of analysis. I didn't think, oh, well, it's 35. Second half of life begins today. This is going to be a far more interesting journey. And I felt a sense of dismay, defeat, and confusion. Having achieved all the goals that I wanted to achieve, why is it that I'm visited by this depression?
Yeah.
The way I would put it today is, why is my psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the agenda that I'm investing these things in? And that was the beginning of a humbling experience for sure, and several years of analysis. And out of that came a whole different life, different profession, and a different orientation to the world.
So our symptoms, as much as we might think of them as alien and want to get rid of them, how do I get rid of this depression?
Mhm.
It, they may be our psyche calling us for
Yeah,
attention.
absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, to look at our
Sure.
lives. And um, you mentioned Jung's book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, but also in your book, you talk about the Red Book. And that seems to have some particular relevance for this time that we're in.
Mhm. Well, Jung was visited by his own midlife distresses too, and while continuing to conduct a life of teaching and research and a full practice and a family life, undertook a very deep inner exploration of the psyche and began to write notes in something called the Black Books, which have just been published about a year ago. And from that, he wrote finally the Red Book, which was his fuller text and illustrations that came to him from his own psyche. The artwork in the Red Book is stunning. If folks haven't
Yeah,
seen it, it's truly impressive. He was actually encouraged to have art shows in Switzerland, but he
really.
said, no, this is personal material.
Uh-huh.
I don't do it for that reason. And all of his images there were intrapsychic images of dreams or coming out of the technique he called active imagination, in which he sort of engaged with the unconscious and sought to paint those dynamics. And they're extraordinarily expressive and challenging. They speak of a kind of other world, because it is other world from the ego standpoint. So it was something that was only recently published. I had the privilege of being involved in the early formative phase of the Philmont Foundation, which was created just to publish the unpublished works of Jung. I mean, as much as he wrote now, which is a full bookshelf and a half, there's even more of his unpublished material that's slowly being published as
Still out there,
still
still
out
out
there,
there, still coming.
still coming. It's
Wow. Yeah.
extraordinary. Yeah.
Wow. That is extraordinary. I want to read another paragraph from what you've written. I think it articulates with what you've been saying. You say, perhaps we can summarize this idea this way. Archetypes are our psychic pictures of the puzzling world into which we were thrown. They give us a handle on the effervescent forms of things and enable us to stand in relationships to their larger other. And other is capitalized O. That's a big concept. The other that the world brings to us. So that's a different take on archetypes than I've heard articulated before.
Mhm.
Psychic pictures of the puzzling world into which we were thrown.
Mhm. Well, maybe life is meaningless. It's the raw exchange of atoms combining and decombining, but we're the creature who brings to it patterning processes which allow us to form concepts, allow us to have emotional responses, give us a sense of meaning and purpose. And so that's coming from some deep symbolic capacity that lies within each of us. we don't make up our dreams. The ego doesn't say, well, I'd like to have a dream of hamburgers tonight, but the ego's, the psyche's never.
I've tried for that. Not
It's
necessarily
not gonna work.
hamburgers. Yeah.
It teaches the otherness of the other there. And yet there's clear evidence that you're dreaming, since we're both 80. Dream research tells us that if you've lived 80 years, as we've been privileged to do, 6 full years of your life is spent dreaming, which is an extraordinary statistic.
It is. It's hard to
And,
grasp.
yeah, and nature doesn't waste energy. It's serving a purpose. And I think one of its purposes is to help process the magnitude of the stimuli our psyche receives any given day, which is why the system has to shut down for something called sleep to continue to metabolize that sensory data. But also, if you pay attention over time, you'll begin to see that there's some other kind of agency at work there, and that it is forming opinions, expressing a point of view, often offering correctives or compensations for what, the understandings of our life as we're experiencing it as an ego consciousness. And so part of the regaining of a personal authority in the second half of life is simply to realize there's something in me that knows more than I know consciously. It has a larger picture. It's trying to communicate with me and expresses its disfavor through pathology, psychopathology, symptoms, when I get off track from that. And when that recognition occurs, it's the beginning of a kind of turn within and a kind of recovery of a personal authority. When I went to Zurich and I was 30, I started analysis in Philadelphia at 35 years old. I was there for 2 years, and I went to Zurich to undertake training as an analyst. Although I didn't plan at that time to leave university life. I thought, this is just something I need to learn for myself. This is the beginning of a journey I can't stop. But each year, more and more conviction that this is a pathway for me that was more interesting than the talk of academia. And it was at the end of the 4th year, after a typically miserable European winter, gray, drizzled almost the entire winter. I came out of analysis, and I'd had one more dream speaking the same thing about a very important issue going on in my life at that time. And I remember thinking, holy cow, or words to that effect. There's something inside of me that has been speaking all this time. Now, obviously, if I had been there for 4 years at that time, I had learned much. I'd made a great deal of commitment to the process. But it was that moment that it moved from a thought of the head into an experience of the heart. At that moment, I thought, there is something in me that knows, and that it's telling me what is the right path for me.
Is that a dream that you could share with us?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Actually,
I
of all these
understand.
years, you're the first person to ask me that. But
Oh,
my point simply is, it was one of many. And
yeah.
it was repetition of the pattern. That's why Jung said often it's not so much the single dream as sometimes it's the accumulation of certain kinds of images. And it had to do with a significant transformation in my understanding of self and world and duty and commitment and that kind of thing too. So it was something that was like the proverbial feather that tilts the balance after a while.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, I think I just have one piece here. I can say to you quite literally, if I have to make a decision of some substantial nature, or even something like how to start an article or a book or a talk or something like that, I sort of put it inside, for lack of better terms. And I'm convinced there's a whole committee of little people running around inside the solar plexus somewhere. And
Right.
they work 24 hours a day, and they always get back to me. Not on the schedule of the ego. I'd like a report at my desk by 5 this afternoon, please. Well, they'll wake me 2 days from now at 3 in the morning. Or I'll be driving the car and I'm distracted by something out there. And suddenly what I'm dealing with is very clear to me. Now, where is that coming from except what Jung called the self with a capital S, to distinguish it from our sense of self, which is mediated by the ego. So it's, put it this way, it's the natural knowing of the organism about what is right for that person in that situation. Now, its interests are not necessarily our fitting in, our comfort, or our freedom from tough times or suffering. It's what nature wants of us, if you will, rather than what does the ego want, which is comfort and predictability and as much control as possible.
Yeah. I've tracked my own dreams for many years. But I think the thing that's been most compelling to me to bring me back to realizing that there's a bigger game going on are the don't block on the word now, the synchronicities. There have been a series of synchronicities in my life that are just, right in my face, that can't be denied as, well, there's something going on here that's way bigger than my ego.
That's
and
right.
and so that's been really important to me. Now, in the context of talking about archetypes in one of the essays in the book, you mentioned going to the Newgrange in Ireland,
Mhm,
and that gave you a glimpse of the archetypal world. Now, I've been to Newgrange as it happens.
mhm.
I was in Ireland. I'd never heard of it, but a friend offered to take me there. Why don't you tell our audience, because I bet a lot of people are like me, maybe haven't heard of Newgrange, and it's
Mhm.
pretty extraordinary. Tell us about that and what the impact it had on you.
Well, certainly. Newgrange was once thought to be just a hill among many other hills, probably a little over an hour's drive northwest of Dublin. And they found that through a channel that went into the interior, that it was a vast burial ground from an ancient civilization. They've since dated it as far back as 3,500 years ago, which makes it
Wow.
older than the pyramids,
Wow.
older than Stonehenge, which is hard to imagine. It's a pre-Celtic, pre-Druidic civilization. And it's a structure that's 90 meters across at the top. From a distance, it almost looks like a football stadium. It's like a curved disc. But you go down through cantilevered boulders. It's hard to remember how far down, but maybe 30 feet down into the underground. There's a large chamber there. And there's a single light that has been, at least when I was there, a single light that has been wired in there. So the guide explains all of this, how long ago it was. And then she turns off the light and you're in total darkness there. And it's extraordinary feeling. You're almost transported to a different psychological state. And then she points out that there's a hole in the ceiling, which is roughly the size of a shoebox, called the latchkey hole. And in the period of the calendar, at solstice time, the winter solstice in the Northern Hemisphere, around December 21st, next 3-4 days, at a certain time of day, while the sun is the farthest south it can be, the solstice, which means sun standing still, nonetheless, there's enough light to pass through that latchkey hole to illumine the chamber for a few minutes. So I'm underneath there. And first of all, I'm thinking, there's no super glue here. There's no steel reinforcement. These are boulders cantilevered against each other. And I'm marveling at the engineering skill of this ancient civilization to achieve that. And I'm just hoping that their expertise lasts a few more minutes while we're done.
Right. It looks like a big pile of rocks, as
It
I
does.
recall.
It
Yeah.
does, exactly. And then secondly, I thought, think of the astronomical sophistication of that culture. I mean, they had no telescopes. This was naked eye, the Northern Hemisphere and miserable atmosphere. And yet they had this much precision. And then thirdly, I thought, think though of the idea, the mythological idea, the archetypal idea of what this is about. It's a place of the burial because they found remains. It's the darkest time of the year. You might say it's in the bowels of nature. In the darkest time of year, there is a scintilla of light that germinates the rebirthing experience. That from this point on, the sun will start its journey backwards to the northern regions. And I thought, I'm in the presence of what is called the Great Mother archetype, and the Great Mother being simply Mother Nature, that which brought us into life and courses through our veins and departs at our death. And I thought, what an extraordinary idea. And I put idea in quotes in the sense of it's a form trying to make sense of this journey. And it's no accident that various religions have attached themselves to the solstice, like iron filings to a magnet. And so you have Hanukkah and Christmas and various other festivals of light at exactly that period in the calendar. Again, it's saying in the great cycle of the Great Mother archetype is death and rebirth, the cycle of sacrifice, the great round, the eternal round, it's sometimes called. And in the dark time, the light is present, albeit in a very, very diminished way, but it's also germinating in such a way as to bring the great cycle back. And it's those cultures that had a set of stories and rituals that link them to the mythology of the Great Mother had a greater respect for nature, number one. They had less problem with aging and mortality than our culture, and had a deep sense of participation in a larger rhythm that was transpersonal in nature. Take that away, and you have a culture like ours, a culture that is constantly fighting a rearguard action against aging and mortality. Terrified of both, and in some way getting more and more neurotic as it separates from nature. So it was one of those moments where I felt I was visiting a timeless aperture into the human imagination, which in its archetypal structuring process had generated this very meaningful sort of encounter, which has a timeless dimension and also says something again about how estranged our culture is from those great rhythms.
In the second essay that you have in the book, you write about reframing our sense of self and the world in plague times. And certainly that's where we find ourselves.
Mhm.
So this brings us all the way back from the time of Newgrange, when that was first constructed, and being really confronted with archetypal forces that are way bigger than we are in our own time.
Mm-hmm. And ironically, way smaller than we think we are because of something that is so small that apparently billions can fit inside the grain of a sand, if I understand correctly about the nature of the virus. So
yeah, that was one of the things I highlighted here. You wrote, an organism 1,000 times smaller than a grain of sand is more powerful than the masters of the earth. Go figure, you say.
right,
The
exactly.
irony of that, go
So,
figure.
well, it certainly reframes our sense of sovereignty in the world, doesn't it? And our sense of
I'll say.
domination over the world. And, in the end, nature always wins. It's just a question of how long the battle lasts. What I think has happened to so many people is it has obliged them to begin to look at their lives apart from the usual places they plug them into. For example, for so many people, going to the factory, going to the office, going to the day job took up so much energy and so much sort of investment of identity. And when you pull the plug on those things and you're on your own and you're not being supported by your daily marching assignment, a lot of people have had a loss of a sense of self. That's what happens when people go through the death of a partner, or loss of a job when they're fired, or downsizing or retirement. We begin to realize how much I invested in that other as a means of sort of my identity, my script, my sense of value, and so forth. And when that's removed for whatever reason, one has to sort of reframe one's sense of self and world. It's also meant that people have had to sort of rediscover a relationship to themselves. Not everybody has managed to do that well. Many people have. Many people have been able to regenerate interests left behind, have discovered everything from new businesses at home to new forms of self-expression. And of course, out of this, the world's going to change a great deal. You know, fewer people are going to be going back to those offices. We've had fewer cars on the road. We've had a lot of changes, the full implications of which we don't know yet.
Right.
But as the world begins the so-called return to normal, that normal is going to be changed. And so whenever we go through some sort of change in our environment, it forces some kind of change in the inner environment as well. And some people have fared well with that, and some people have had a great deal of difficulty.
Yeah, I like it where you write the human ego tasked with interacting with the outer world so often imagines itself big boss, the emperor of impulse, the diviner of desire, and the czar of choice. All the while, it is a fragile cluster of energy full of, here was a new word for me, tergiversations,
Yes,
tergiversations,
yeah.
contradictions, swirling fears, rationalizations, excuses, and shabby justifications.
Mm-hmm. Yep. In other words,
I had to look up tergiversations.
yes,
Uh,
yes, yes.
and I'm trying to tell me again what it means.
Well, sure. It's the various distractions and sidebars that we can slide into. Distractions would be another word that we might use.
Okay.
Diversions, you know, 1,000 things. It's like when they're taken away, such as happens when maybe we have a serious illness or one has enforced isolation for some reason. Then you begin to realize how much my socialized roles, my daily schedule played in carrying my sense of self. Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, you know, long before Home Shopping Network and the internet, said humankind's chief difficulty is its inability to be alone with itself in its private chamber for very long at all. Mm. Why is it so intolerable to be present to ourselves? That's a question I think this plague time has caused many people to ask in so many words, or perhaps to run from asking it, but then to realize you just keep running up against it nonetheless.
Well, you reposition the plague in a way by suggesting that COVID might be seen as a divine encounter.
Well, I have no idea what it is, except once when his later years, Jung was asked to define what he meant by God. And he said, I call God that which flings itself violently across our path and alters our conscious intentions for good or for ill. Now, that's a very peculiar definition. He's obviously not making a metaphysical statement or a theological statement as much as he's saying whatever radically causes us to reframe our sense of self and world is an encounter with the mystery. You know, he would associate the idea of a God with the mystery. He said, you can't, anything we say about God is saying more about us than it is some unknown mystery. But when you think about what causes you to sort of encounter that mystery, then you're in it, you're swimming in it. And I think this plague has been more than a practical problem, more than a moral problem, more than a governmental issue, more than a medical issue. It's been a spiritual crisis for most people, almost all people to some degree. And then you have to deal with the question, all right, what is it then that feeds my soul, nurtures my spirit, gives me a sense of meaning and purpose when I can't turn to those things that may have done so in the past? And I think that's probably a healthy question, even though none of us want to have gone through this.
Right, right. And and one way that it's characterized as the other, that the not me, the not me, the not us, something from the outside that I have no control over.
Mhm.
And that confrontation by the other triggers fears and anxiety, which you say can drive crazy responses.
Yes, yes, sure. And the mystery of the other is found in all relationships. It's just that what we tend to do is impose upon the radical nature of the other in life our own agendas in order to serve our presumed needs and give us a fantasy of control. And that's why when your normal systems are taken away from you, there's a profound sense of disruption, which causes anxiety and causes a sense of helplessness and anger and so forth. And, one of our biggest addictions, and people wouldn't think of it as an addiction, but I think it's one we all have, is habit. Habit is our way of, again, imposing upon the raw chaos of life certain expectations and gives us the fantasy of predictability and control, which happens to be something the human ego in its insecurity prefers over the loss of control. Wheresoever there's anxiety, wheresoever there's ambiguity, wheresoever there's ambivalence, the human ego is going to be disoriented a little bit and be troubled and will seek to reconstitute its original position if it can possibly do that.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons for a lot of the resistance to the medical advice we got from the CDC through the past year or so, is that the people were simply unwilling or perhaps, undisciplined enough to think that these appropriate medical steps would be helpful, because it takes from us our presumptive ego sovereignty. Well, so does dying from COVID, by the way. So, measure your costs there and figure out which is to your advantage.
Yeah. You point out that we have the illusion of everything being stable and a kind of security as long as our life is predictable. But you point out, and I quote here, we are always mortal, always in peril. That is the status of daily life. But the real question is, do we retain a personal dignity, a personal integrity, or do we live furtive and fugitive lives? Our parents, our children, ourselves, all of us are on the same journey. Why should I think myself exempt?
Sure, sure. Well, the human ego partly survives through distraction and denial, as we all know. And we need to be, and this is not morbid. The fact that we think it's morbid says something about our culture and our complexes. But we need to be mindful of our mortality every single day, because it helps us come to the question, all right, is what I'm doing really the thing I want to do with my life? Am I in some way simply slip sliding through life? Have I let fear or habituation given too much control, and I'm just caught in my habituated patterns? Plato said the proper life, the philosophic life, was the contemplation of death every day, not in a kind of morbid sort of preoccupation, but simply reminder. If one understands the preciousness of life and the fragility of life and the transience of life, then one says, what am I doing this with my life? Maybe I might want to make other decisions, you see. And because we're meaning-seeking creatures, and when we are disconnected from meaning, however defined by our systems, the psyche knows it, and it shows up in 1,000 ways. And As therapists, we know what brings people to our offices from time to time. And that is in many ways a flight from encountering the magnitude and the summons of their own soul.
Yeah, and there's a real tendency to deny the magnitude of what we're in, and and as you point out, many people are waiting for things to snap back to normal,
Yes.
but but it doesn't. It's way too big to snap back to anything that felt like normal. And given all the pain around us, many will attempt to mollify it. And you've got an essay on the wounded healer.
Mhm.
And so I think many people who already identify as psychotherapists or healers or helpers of one sort or another, you've got an essay on the wounded healer, and how does that apply to this situation where we might be tempted to rush in and feel like, okay, I'm going to be the healer.
Well, first of all, there's a wounded healer in all of us because there's a deep-seated fantasy and need in each of us to have the other as healthy as possible, because that makes our life work better, and maybe they can be helpful to us in that regard. But those who have ostensibly chosen a helping profession, whether it's nursing, social work, clergy, whatever, are often, not always, but often the child who was most sensitized to the disturbances in the field of his family of origin or to the society around him. And it became a kind of necessary and urgent project for that child to make the adaptations necessary. And many of those folks grow up to identify with it in an intrapsychic way, that part of my job is to help take care of my world. And it's a noble profession, to be sure. And on the other hand, it's often fueled by one's own traumas. And so what that does, of course, is lead people to a great deal of internal stress, as one's own psychological material is constantly being activated in the work. I mean, we've seen the stress, for example, in medical personnel.
Oh, yeah.
None of them signed up for this onslaught that has come to them. And it's burned out and hurt so many of those dear souls. And so we're all grateful for their sacrifice. But what price to them? And to some degree, that's inherent in being a wounded healer. We're not automatons. And so this is a chapter that's looking at what it is that leads us into that role, what sets us up for further wounding, what sets us up perhaps for violations of boundaries and other such issues that occur in intimate professional relationships, and what we have to do towards self-healing. As a kind of healer who can't fix the world, at best we have to start working on ourselves a little bit better.
Yeah, well, Jim, I think we've covered about as much of the book as we can right now. I wonder if there are any sort of final closing thoughts that you might want to leave our audience with. I really encourage people to get this book and sit down with it, because we look to people like you who have devoted their life to self-examination and deep thinking to shed a little light.
Well, first of all, David, it's been a pleasure to talk with you again. As I mentioned, these are 11 essays on different subjects, and each one of them is showing a different facet of our experience. Again, issues of narcissism, aging, the risk of commitment, disorders of desire. I mean, it's a variety of subject matters. But the most important thing I think you've touched on very well today, and that is we all need to reflect on our lives, ask ourselves some very basic questions, that the neglect of which I think means more of our life is on automatic pilot than we would like to think it is. And that is, of any given choice that I have to make, what is that really in service to inside of me? I have to add that word really, because you can't trust your first response. It's also going to be driven by an old fear or an archaic message within you, a very powerful complex. And to know that when we come to choices in life, as we do almost every day, to ask another basic question: does this path enlarge me or does it diminish me as a human being? And we usually know the answer to that question. It has to do with our choice of relationships, careers, investments of value. Does this path enlarge me? Does it diminish me? And if you don't know, you keep asking the question and it will reveal itself. And you have to choose the path that's enlarging. It may not be so comfortable, but it will be a more interesting journey. And I've said to many clients through the years, it's not about curing you. You're not an illness. You're an investment by nature or divinity into this world. And this will make a more interesting journey. And if you realize your own life is full of large choices every day, and that values are up for grabs, and that every day is a summons of accountability to the inner world as well as the outer world, then you find it's a very interesting and exciting life. And you'll find that you enjoy being in that kind of arena more than you would have ever thought.
That in fact does give us a little light, like in the Newgrange, there's that light there beckoning to us.
That's right.
And I want to thank you for sharing your light with us today. Dr. James Hollis, for being my guest once again on Shrink Wrap Radio, and hopefully not for the last time.